I still remember that seemingly ordinary morning as if it were etched in stone. The day began with the same gentle routine that had defined my life for over a decade. My name is Jack Reynolds, and I prided myself on the stability of a well-ordered life. Every day, I woke before dawn in our quiet suburban home in Oak Ridge, a small town where neighbors greeted one another by name and the rhythm of life flowed steadily. Yet that morning carried a weight I wouldn't understand until much later. The alarm clock had buzzed at 5:45 a.m., and I rose without hesitation. I shuffled into the kitchen where my wife, Karen, was already preparing breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with toasted bread filled the air as she hummed a familiar tune. Her warm smile as she greeted me was the very picture of normalcy, a symbol of a partnership built on years of shared routine. I kissed her cheek and, with a nod, left for work, confident in the simplicity of our everyday life. I worked as a foreman at the local manufacturing plant, a job that demanded precision and long, measured hours. The drive through Oak Ridge was as predictable as clockwork. I passed the same neat rows of houses, the well-manicured lawns, and the tidy storefronts that lined Main Street. Nothing in those familiar scenes hinted at any disruption. The morning radio played soft country tunes, and I felt the steady pulse of routine carrying me onward. At the plant, I greeted my crew with a firm handshake and a nod of reassurance. The day's tasks were clear: manage schedules, inspect equipment, and ensure that every part of our operation ran like a well-oiled machine. Amid the hum of machinery and the clatter of tools, I found comfort in the tangible progress of our work. There was order here, in the predictable nature of the tasks that filled my day. During a short break, I glanced at the TV in the break room. A news report flashed across the screen showing Police Chief Michael Donovan addressing a crowd at a community event. Donovan's presence was commanding, his voice resonant as he spoke about safety and unity in Oak Ridge. I had always respected the chief. His steady hand and calm demeanor were qualities that made him a pillar of our community. I noted his smile and the way the crowd responded with warmth and admiration. At that moment, I never imagined that his name would later be tied to a secret that would shatter my life. After a long day, I returned home as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The neighborhood looked peaceful in the twilight, children riding bicycles, neighbors chatting by mailboxes, and I felt a sense of contentment as I pulled into our driveway. Our house, with its white siding and welcoming porch light, stood as a testament to years of hard work and shared dreams. Inside, the home was filled with familiar sounds: the low murmur of the television, the clink of dishes in the kitchen, and Karen's gentle laughter as she recounted her day. Over dinner, we exchanged the standard pleasantries, stories from work, plans for the weekend, even a mention of the upcoming community outreach event at the police station. Karen casually noted that she would be attending the event later this week. I nodded, trusting her implicitly as I always had. After dinner, as darkness settled over Oak Ridge, I retired to the study to review some paperwork for the next day. The house was quiet, the only sounds those of the soft ticking clock and the distant hum of a car passing by outside. I reviewed the documents methodically, my thoughts drifting between numbers and schedules. The evening passed in a gentle blur of routine, until a knock at the door interrupted the silence. I opened the door to find a neatly folded envelope resting on the welcome mat. The envelope bore no return address and was stamped with a small insignia that I couldn't immediately place. Puzzled, I picked it up and examined it. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed in a plain font. It read only, "Community Outreach Meeting, 7 p.m. Oak Ridge Police Headquarters." I glanced around for any hint of its origin, but there was nothing. I folded the note carefully and placed it on the desk. I assumed it must have been intended for Karen, a simple reminder for her volunteer work. Nothing out of the ordinary for our small town. Before retiring for the night, I paused by the living room window, looking out over the quiet street. The stars were beginning to twinkle above, and for a moment, the world felt perfectly ordered. I felt a brief surge of pride in the stability of my life, the unchanging rhythm of work, home, and familiar faces. It was a comforting thought, one that I clung to as I turned off the lights and headed to bed. Little did I know that this small, unremarkable envelope was the first sign of a storm brewing beneath the surface. The routine that had long been my sanctuary was about to be disrupted by secrets I could never have anticipated. In the coming days, as I continued to work, come home, and live my life as I always had, subtle clues would begin to emerge, clues that would force me to confront a betrayal so unexpected it would shake the very foundation of my existence. The next morning, I awoke with the same sense of certainty as always. I dressed in my work clothes, kissed Karen goodbye with the same loving familiarity, and headed out into the crisp morning air. The envelope from the previous night lay hidden on my desk, a silent reminder of the evening's mystery. I carried on with my day, unaware that each tick of the clock was drawing me closer to a truth that would alter my life forever. At work, I performed my tasks with a steady hand and a focused mind. But even as I supervised the crew and checked the progress of our projects, there was an undercurrent of distraction. I couldn't shake the thought of the note or the brief glimpse I'd caught of Karen's phone earlier that evening, a glimpse that hinted at a secret conversation. I told myself that these were merely coincidences, minor details that held no real consequence. Yet, as the day wore on, I began to notice other small discrepancies: a text message received at odd hours, a hurried phone call in the middle of dinner, a guarded look exchanged when Karen mentioned the police outreach event. I returned home that evening with a mind full of these unspoken details. As I sat down with Karen for a quiet dinner, the conversation flowed as normally as ever, though I couldn't help but feel that something was off. Her eyes, which usually sparkled with warmth, now seemed to hold a trace of distraction. I chose not to press her on it, trusting that our long years together would weather any passing moment of unease. After dinner, while Karen attended to some chores in the other room, I found myself alone in the study with the envelope and my growing list of questions. I stared at the plain sheet of paper again, the words, "Community Outreach Meeting, 7 p.m., now taking on a significance I could not ignore. My mind began to piece together a picture of a life I thought I knew, a life defined by predictable routines and steadfast trust. The envelope, the subtle changes in Karen's behavior, and the quiet efficiency of my own daily existence were about to collide in a way I had never imagined. That night, as I lay in bed with the gentle hum of the house surrounding me, I couldn't help but wonder if the world I trusted was built on more fragile foundations than I had believed. The routine was slipping away, and a small, insistent whisper of betrayal was beginning to echo in the dark. I fell asleep with the envelope on my nightstand, a silent testament to the mystery that lay ahead. A mystery that would soon force me to question everything I once took for granted. In Oak Ridge, where every day was as predictable as the sunrise, nothing seemed out of place. But the seeds of doubt had been sown, and with each new morning, the calm before the storm was steadily giving way to the unknown. And so, as the days turned into weeks, I would learn that even the most unyielding routine can hide secrets that, once uncovered, forever change the course of a life. In the days following that seemingly ordinary morning, subtle irregularities began to emerge, small details that, on their own, might have been dismissed as minor quirks but soon accumulated into a pattern that could not be ignored. At first, I chalked it up to the usual ebb and flow of daily life, trusting that the steady routine I had built in Oak Ridge would prevail. But as each day unfolded, those tiny deviations started to chip away at the facade of certainty. One crisp afternoon, while preparing dinner, Karen mentioned that she'd been invited to a special meeting at the police station regarding a new neighborhood outreach program. "It's about community safety, Jack," she explained casually as she set the table. She offered little detail, simply noting that the meeting would be held later that week. Her tone was matter-of-fact, yet something in her eyes suggested a hesitance that I couldn't quite pinpoint. I nodded and replied, "That sounds important," but the comment hung in the air, unanswered. Later that evening, as I cleared the dishes in the quiet of the kitchen, I noticed a neatly folded envelope resting atop the counter. The envelope was immaculate, its paper crisp and embossed with a subtle insignia that I did not immediately recognize. There was no return address, and the handwriting on the envelope was formal but impersonal. I set it aside without reading its contents immediately, assuming it might be related to one of those community notices Karen often received. The following morning, on my drive to the manufacturing plant, I found my thoughts repeatedly drifting back to that envelope. The familiar streets of Oak Ridge passed by in a blur as I replayed the image in my mind. It was a small thing, a simple envelope among many, but its presence stirred an inexplicable unease in me. At work, the steady clamor of machinery and the routine check-ins with my crew did little to dispel my distracted thoughts. I was meticulous by nature, so I noted the time of my arrival and the sequence of events as I settled into the day. Yet, the image of the envelope kept resurfacing. During a brief break in the plant's cafeteria, I overheard a conversation among colleagues about recent changes in the community outreach program. One of them mentioned that Police Chief Michael Donovan had been personally involved in launching the new initiative. I listened intently. His name, which I had always associated with honor and duty, was now tied to something that felt oddly personal. When I returned home that evening, I found the house illuminated by the soft glow of the living room lamp, and Karen was in the kitchen preparing a light dinner. We exchanged the usual greetings and small talk, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that an undercurrent of secrecy had begun to infiltrate our daily routine. After dinner, as Karen went to tend to some household tasks in the other room, I retrieved the envelope from the counter and finally opened it. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, was a terse message. Community Outreach Meeting, 7 p.m. Oak Ridge Police Headquarters. The message was unsigned, though the style of the lettering hinted at an association with the police department. My mind raced. Was this intended for Karen? Had she forgotten it on the counter? I folded the note carefully and placed it in my wallet, deciding to let the day pass before drawing any conclusions. That night, as I lay in bed, the envelope's message replayed in my mind alongside other subtle anomalies. I recalled a brief moment earlier in the week when Karen had been on her phone, her eyes flicking to the screen with an intensity that was unusual for a casual check of messages. I wondered if those were connected, if the envelope was just the first small sign of something larger. Yet, I told myself that every long marriage carries its share of minor mysteries, and it would be unwise to jump to any conclusions based on a few isolated incidents. Over the next several days, the inconsistencies multiplied. On a late afternoon, as I returned home from a particularly long shift, I found Karen's car not in its usual spot in the driveway but parked farther down the street near the police station. I assumed she might have run a quick errand, perhaps related to the community outreach meeting, but the deviation from our routine struck me as odd. I made a mental note of the time, marking it down later in a small leather-bound notebook where I casually recorded details that didn't quite fit the pattern of our everyday life. A couple of days later, while Karen was out, I noticed another anomaly. A receipt from a local diner, a place I rarely frequented, was left on the kitchen table. The timestamp on the receipt was in the early evening, around 6:45 p.m., which coincided with the time mentioned on the envelope. The receipt was printed on a small piece of paper, neatly folded, and bore no other explanation. I tucked it into the notebook along with the envelope's note, the image of which now resonated with a growing sense of foreboding. Throughout the week, I found myself becoming increasingly aware of Karen's unexplained absences and hurried phone calls. There were evenings when she would leave the house for a quick errand and return later than usual. On more than one occasion, I overheard her speaking in a low, measured tone when she thought I wasn't within earshot, a tone that hinted at a conversation meant to be private. I refrained from asking too many questions, partly out of respect for the life we'd built together, and partly out of a cautious hope that these were nothing more than incidental occurrences. I continued with my routine at the manufacturing plant, where the steady work provided a temporary escape from the nagging questions at home. Yet, every time I parked my car or walked through the familiar streets of Oak Ridge, I found my eyes searching for more clues: a car parked out of place, a window left open, or a figure I didn't recognize. It was as if the fabric of our daily life had begun to fray at the edges, revealing tiny gaps that whispered of secrets. One particularly crisp evening, I returned home earlier than usual, driven by a need to piece together the growing mosaic of small details. The house was quiet, the only light coming from the living room where a single lamp cast long shadows. I found the envelope on the kitchen counter again, now accompanied by a fresh crease on a piece of paper, a note that had apparently been added after the first message. This new note read, "Don't be late." The initials sent a chill down my spine. They seemed to confirm the connection between the envelope and Chief Michael Donovan, whose name I had heard mentioned in relation to the community outreach initiative. With each passing day, I recorded the details with the precision of a man who trusted in facts above all else. The routine I had once considered unassailable was now punctuated by these quiet, methodical clues: a stray receipt here, a misplaced car there, and the repeated appearance of cryptic notes referencing a time and a place. I wasn't yet ready to confront Karen, not without further evidence, so I let the observations accumulate. As the week drew to a close, the picture that was emerging became harder to ignore. Every anomaly, every unexplained detail, pointed toward a secret life that Karen seemed determined to keep hidden from me. In the back of my mind, the familiar and trusted world I had built in Oak Ridge began to feel less secure, as if a hidden current was slowly eroding the foundation of our shared routine. That night, as I sat alone with my notebook spread out on the desk, I reviewed each entry carefully. The envelope's message, the diner receipt, the note signed MD, and the mysterious car parked near the police station, all of these small pieces formed a puzzle I was determined to solve. I didn't allow my emotions to overtake the facts. I simply continued to record the details, knowing that the truth would eventually reveal itself through the steady accumulation of evidence. In that quiet solitude, I wondered how easily a life built on routine could begin to unravel with just a few subtle deviations. The stability I had once taken for granted was now compromised by whispers of a secret that I was only beginning to understand. I closed the notebook with a sense of unease, aware that the calm before the storm was drawing to a close. The next morning, I rose with the same resolve as before, preparing for another day at work, yet with an underlying tension that I could no longer shake. Every familiar sight in Oak Ridge, every street, every house, every passing face, now seemed to hide a mystery waiting to be uncovered. And with each tick of the clock, I could feel the steady rhythm of our old life slipping further away, replaced by the quiet, insistent clues of a betrayal I was soon destined to confront. In the days that followed, the pattern of inconsistencies grew ever clearer. Each seemingly insignificant detail began to converge, forming a mosaic that I could no longer ignore. I continued my daily routine at the manufacturing plant, but the familiar cadence of my life in Oak Ridge was now punctuated by these quiet anomalies, each one a small crack in the facade of the trust one once held dear. One overcast afternoon, I arrived home slightly earlier than usual. The air felt heavy, and a steady drizzle had set in. I stepped into the house expecting the routine evening calm, yet something in the quiet made me pause. In the living room, the soft hum of the television played without distraction, but the empty armchair beside the sofa caught my attention. Karen's usual spot was vacant, and the silence in that corner felt deliberate. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 6:20 p.m. This was around the time she often left on those mysterious errands, but today it felt different, more purposeful. I checked my notebook. Over the past week, I had logged every instance of her unusual departures, the extra time on the phone, the vague text messages, and the receipts from an unfamiliar diner that consistently appeared around 6:45 p.m. There was one particular entry that continued to gnaw at me, a note marked, "Don't be late." I folded that slip of paper carefully and put it back in the notebook. Its neat handwriting and the unmistakable initials, "MD," now had a more ominous significance than a mere reminder. That evening, after a light dinner during which Karen's conversation was terse and distracted, I decided to retrace her usual route. I left the house under the pretense of checking on a work call and drove slowly through the residential streets of Oak Ridge. I made my way toward the area near the police station, where I had observed her car parked on more than one occasion. The drizzle had turned into a steady rain by the time I reached the vicinity of 15 Harrison Avenue, a modest building whose unassuming exterior belied the secrets it now seemed to harbor. I parked discreetly a block away and sat in my car, watching the building through the rain-streaked windshield. It was nearly 6:30 p.m., the time that matched the note's instructions. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The building's entrance was quiet, with a couple of figures moving about behind glass doors. I strained to see more details through the blurred reflection on the wet pavement. Then, almost imperceptibly, I caught sight of a figure emerging from the building. It was a man in a sharply pressed uniform, his posture confident, his face set in a calm expression. I recognized him instantly from a news clip, Police Chief Michael Donovan. His presence in that area was unexpected but not entirely out of the question given his involvement with community projects. Yet, the timing was too precise to be a mere coincidence. I remained parked, the rain muffling the sounds of the street. For nearly 15 minutes, I watched as Chief Donovan walked purposefully toward a waiting car parked at the curb. I couldn't tell if he was alone or accompanied by someone, as the view was obstructed by the downpour and passing vehicles. The image was fleeting, but the connection between the note signed MD and the police chief became harder to dismiss. Back home that night, while Karen was briefly out, she mentioned an errand. I retrieved my notebook and compared today's observations with the previous entries. I had now documented several occurrences: the recurring appearance of the envelope and note, the diner receipt timestamped at 6:45 p.m., and the consistent pattern of her leaving the house around the same time. Even the shared calendar on our computer now had several entries referencing community outreach and safety meeting, with no detailed explanation provided. The more I examined these facts, the clearer it became that Karen had been orchestrating her time away with precision, ensuring that every departure was accounted for on a schedule known only to her. I began to compile my observations systematically, assigning each event a timestamp and location. The notes were factual and unemotional, a list of dates, times, and observations recorded with the detached clarity of someone who trusted in the solidity of facts. There was no dramatic flourish, only the steady accumulation of details that, together, painted a picture of a secret life. On another overcast evening, I decided to test my growing hypothesis. I left a few minutes before the time Karen typically departed, hoping to observe her movement without drawing attention. From a discreet distance, I watched as her car pulled out of the driveway. I noted the direction in which she headed, and it wasn't toward any usual destination like the community center or the local market. Instead, her route led directly toward the police station area, along streets I had scarcely paid attention to before. Every turn and stop was logged meticulously in my notebook. As I followed at a safe distance, my mind remained focused on the tangible, the precise locations, the recurring times, the repeated reference to MD in the messages and notes. The clarity of these facts left little room for alternative explanations. By the time her car merged with the traffic near the station, I was convinced that the pattern was deliberate and that the initials MD unmistakably pointed to Chief Michael Donovan. Returning home that night, I felt an uneasy sense of inevitability. I had gathered enough evidence to suspect that Karen's involvement with the police chief was not a mere passing acquaintance, but a sustained, carefully hidden arrangement. Every detail, her late departures, the cryptic notes, the consistent alignment with the police station schedule, spoke of a betrayal that was as methodical as it was profound. I placed my notebook on the desk and sat back, scanning the entries one more time. I did not allow emotion to color my notes. Instead, I observed the facts as if they were pieces in a puzzle slowly coming together. The steady rhythm of my daily life was now interrupted by these discrete anomalies, each one a subtle chime in the underlying discord of our shared routine. By the time I retired for the night, the rain had stopped, and a quiet stillness filled the house. Yet even in that silence, the echo of each carefully logged detail reverberated in my mind. The evidence was mounting, small, methodical clues that left little doubt about the secret Karen was keeping. The routine I once trusted was slipping away, replaced by the quiet unraveling of a life built on unspoken lies. As I finally closed my eyes, I knew that tomorrow would bring new observations, and with them, the unavoidable confrontation of the truth. The steady cadence of Oak Ridge and the familiar order of my world had been infiltrated by secrets, and the coming days promised nothing less than a reckoning with a betrayal that was as cold and calculated as it was deeply personal. That overcast evening, with the persistent drizzle subsiding into a quiet mist, brought the culmination of weeks of careful observation and mounting evidence. I sat alone in the living room, the muted light from a single lamp casting long shadows over the floor. My notebook lay open on the coffee table, every page filled with dates, times, and locations, a systematic record of Karen's inexplicable departures and the repeated appearances of cryptic notes signed E. The evidence, laid out in cold, unadorned facts, left no room for doubt. My wife had been meeting with Police Chief Michael Donovan. I had long resolved to let the facts speak for themselves. But now, with the steady cadence of our familiar routine shattered, I could no longer remain silent. I waited until Karen returned from another late outing, a time that I now knew was consistently marked by a precise schedule, before I decided that the time had come to confront her. When the front door opened and Karen stepped inside, she seemed momentarily startled by my presence. I didn't raise my voice or let bitterness seep into my tone. Instead, I gestured for her to sit at the dining table, where I had already spread out the items: the original envelope and its subsequent note, the diner receipt, and several entries from our shared calendar. The evidence was arranged in a matter-of-fact display, a silent testament to the breach of trust. "Karen," I began evenly, "I've been keeping track of your schedule. The note signed MD, the calendar entries, the receipts, they all point to something you haven't told me." I let my words hang in the still air, each syllable measured and deliberate. Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite decipher, a mix of resignation and perhaps a hint of regret. For a moment, the room was filled only with the sound of my steady breathing and the soft ticking of the wall clock. Finally, in a voice that was calm but devoid of the warmth we once shared, she said, "Jack, it's not as complicated as you think." I pressed on, "Then explain why you've been meeting at the police station area, why you left notes, and why your schedule consistently aligns with the outreach programs led by Chief Donovan." I pointed to the neat script on the note. MD clearly stands for Michael Donovan. For a long, silent moment, Karen's gaze dropped to the papers before her. "I met with him as part of the outreach," she said in a flat tone. "At first, it was strictly about community safety. But over time, our meetings, they evolved." She paused as if weighing her words. "I never intended for it to become what it has. I thought I could keep it separate from our home, from us." Her explanation was as matter-of-fact as the evidence itself. There was no dramatic display of sorrow or furious indignation, just a quiet admission of a secret that had grown steadily beyond control. "You never told me," I replied simply. "You let this happen behind my back, and while you claim it began as part of your community work, the notes and the timing show that it was planned on your terms." Karen's eyes met mine briefly, and for an instant, I saw the weight of her decision. "I know," she whispered. "I was afraid that I'd lose everything if I was honest. I thought I could manage both worlds without hurting you." Her voice was low, almost defeated. The silence that followed was heavy with the finality of our conversation. I felt no sudden burst of anger, only a profound sense of loss, as if the life I once knew had been quietly dismantled piece by piece. "You built a routine that I trusted," I said, my voice steady. "I worked every day believing in that routine. And now, all I have are these facts, these quiet details that betray a promise we once shared." There was no need for dramatic accusations or tearful declarations. The evidence was irrefutable, and the truth, in its unembellished form, had already changed everything. I explained that I needed time to process what I had learned and to decide on the next steps. "Right now, I need space," I continued. "I need to think about how we move forward from here." Karen nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Without another word, she excused herself and retreated to our bedroom, leaving me alone with the undeniable remnants of a shattered trust. I spent the rest of the evening in quiet contemplation, reviewing my notebook and the physical proof of a betrayal that was as systematic as it was unexpected. There was no explosive outburst, no frantic scramble for explanations, just the stark realization that the world I had trusted was built on routines that had been manipulated without my knowledge. In the days that followed, I took deliberate steps to secure my own future. I met with a lawyer to discuss our separation and began organizing the practical matters of disentangling our shared lives. The process was clinical and methodical, a series of appointments and legal consultations, each one a reminder that even the most steadfast routines can be dismantled by hidden truths. I returned to work, throwing myself into the tangible tasks of managing the manufacturing plant, where the steady clatter of machinery and the rhythm of production provided a counterpoint to the quiet dissolution of my personal life. Colleagues noticed a change in me, a calm detachment that replaced the warmth I once exuded. I became more focused, channeling my energy into the work that I knew I could control. At home, the atmosphere had shifted. Our shared spaces, once filled with the familiar sounds and comforts of a long-standing marriage, now seemed to echo with the absence of genuine connection. Karen and I spoke only when necessary, our interactions confined to logistical matters. The police chief, Michael Donovan, remained a public figure, one who was still admired for his work in the community, but in our household his name had become synonymous with betrayal. As the weeks turned into months, I slowly began to rebuild my life around the unyielding clarity of facts. I recognized that the quiet nature of this betrayal, its methodical, unadorned unfolding, left little room for the dramatics that often accompany such revelations. Instead, it forced me to accept the reality with a sober resolve. I learned to find solace in the routine that I could control, in the tangible tasks of daily life, and in the knowledge that while the past could not be undone, the future was still mine to shape. Driving away from the house on the day I finally packed my things for a temporary stay at a friend's place, I did so without a backward glance. The betrayal was complete, and though the pain lingered, it was now firmly a part of a chapter one had to close. I embraced the road ahead with a quiet determination to build a new life, one founded on the hard, unyielding facts of reality rather than on fragile illusions of trust. In the end, the reckoning was not a moment of explosive violence or dramatic despair. It was a gradual, measured acknowledgement that the routines we depend on can hide secrets that, once revealed, change everything. The betrayal by Karen and the man I once respected as a guardian of our community had unraveled the fabric of my familiar world. And as I continued forward, I carried with me the certainty that while the past might scar, it would not define the new path I chose to forge, one built on the clarity of truth and the quiet strength to rebuild after the storm. And I had just stepped into a game that was much, much bigger than I ever realized. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.